From the very moment humans gained the ability to verbally communicate, we have been telling stories. And while these tall tales serve as the backbone of society, there's always been a glaring limitation: engagement. A story can be structured in any fashion the writer wishes. Despite the seemingly infinite amount of possibilities that arise within story structure, there is still one massive limitation, regardless of structure. And that limitation is participation. There's no way in conventional storytelling, whether that be vocal or written, that allows for the audience to actively play a role in the story. Now, obviously, there have been attempts at audience participation in the form of something akin to a choose-your-own-adventure book. However, you can't develop the protagonist in these stories because the reader is the protagonist. But what if I told you that there was a way for people to tell stories that doesn't just have an active audience participation, but will not work at all if there is no audience? And rather than simply explaining what this brave new form of storytelling is, I feel like I should paint a picture. Imagine, if you will, that you're on a ship, traveling to an unknown location. It's raining heavily, and you have no memory of how you came to be on said ship. Now, in a choose-your-own-adventure book, you'd be given a select amount of paths and options that you could choose to advance the plot. And in a more conventional story, you wouldn't have a choice. But when playing a tabletop role-playing game, the only limits as to what you can do on said ship is your imagination. For the sake of context, I'm going to assume that a majority of the audience doesn't know what a role-playing game is. To put it within layman's terms, a role-playing game is a heavily story-driven game where a player takes up the role of a character. These characters are made by the players and have special abilities that can be used by specific classes. For instance, a barbarian is known for their high damage attacks and large pool of health, but a druid is much more focused on support and magic. For an example of what a well-known role-playing game or RPG looks like, look no further than Dungeons and Dragons. Dungeons and Dragons is based purely off of high fantasy, but there are other games that focus on other settings. For example, the game Call of Cthulhu focuses on a Victorian setting as opposed to a fantasy setting. The game is typically played in turns, with each character doing a myriad of actions, like moving objects, looking at their surroundings, trying to depict magic, or performing for a crowd. This gives Dungeons and Dragons a sense of depth that cannot be found within other mediums. Going back to our ship setting, a wizard is going to handle the situation much differently than a cleric or a barbarian. And that's the beauty of a tabletop RPG. It is the ultimate form of escapism and one of the only interactive mediums of art. But while there are infinite possibilities in some regards, your average Dungeons and Dragons campaign is still limited in some areas too. For example, while a character can take any form you want, some characters fall into specific archetypes. For example, a barbarian who is a gentle giant, or a morally bankrupt rogue with a heart of gold. But the cliched characterization mentioned above is easily avoided once you become aware of their trappings. Despite the potential of role-playing games, its success is fully placed on the shoulders of the people playing the games. Simply put, the more invested a player becomes within the world they find themselves in, the more rich of an experience everyone else has. But an issue arises when a player begins to see the game as the game. We call those people munchkins. Rather than acting out the character that they've established, they start to see every encounter as something that can be won or lost. Every plot point that the game master has meticulously planned melts away, and the player begins to alienate everyone by acting erratically. This is like if Hamlet turned into a giant mecha robot and murdered everyone with no sense of remorse or guilt. So what's the takeaway? If one goes into a role-playing game like Dungeons and Dragons with the right mentality, it'll be one of the most rewarding experiences ever. In the world of role-playing games, there are no limits on the content of conventional storytelling, and the players work together to write their own collaborative and interactive story. This will, can, and has revolutionized public perception, ultimately changing the world of stories from something that can be seen and heard to something that can be experienced and lived in. Thank you very much.